Hey, on the 110, this is Ensign Alex Wong again with Captain Mulaney. We're here to talk today about the skill of understanding emotions. So, Captain, what does it mean to understand emotions?
I think a helpful way to think about that is to think about triggers. So triggers are kind of the extreme cases when very intense emotions are brought up by specific things, and pretty much everybody has triggers. You may or may not think that you are triggered by things. I bet you can think of three things that you know would trigger your roommate or your brother or sister or your parents, right? So it turns out it's a lot easy to perceive triggers in other people because we kind of think of those as landmines and we know not to walk in those places with other people. It's a little bit more difficult to recognize the triggers in ourselves. But if we think about triggers, then we can think about understanding emotion, because the question that comes with understanding emotion is, what is pushing my trigger in the first place? What is the stimulus that's causing this response? And that takes a fair amount, I think, of internal reflection, which is not always the easiest thing to do while emotions are happening. So sometimes it requires us, and the people typically do this somewhat naturally. If you have a bad interaction with somebody, you'll probably go back and replay that interaction in your mind. And when you're replaying that interaction in your mind, I think we can have bad habits about that. We can be self-justifying. So we can go back and revisit those moments and double down on all the things that we felt in the first place and say, well, all I was saying was this, and they got all huffy with me, et cetera, et cetera. From an emotional intelligence perspective, probably a much more healthy thing to do is to ask yourself, so why did that make me emotional? What was at stake for me in that moment?
It doesn't even necessarily have to be a bad emotion or a bad experience. It could be something good. Say during the holidays with your family, you notice something that your mom or dad really likes, and you can do something similar to that on another occasion and try to stimulate that happiness.
Absolutely, yeah. So generating this awareness that emotions are happening, and then thinking critically about what are the causes and effects. In some ways, as a skill that can be developed, we recognize that this isn't rocket science necessarily. It's just a matter of paying attention and asking ourselves the right questions at the right times in order to understand those emotions. And I will tell you, so when we talk about triggers, our mind is pretty tricky, and there's certain things that we're insecure about. There's certain things that we're touchy about, and our minds do a lot of work to try to protect us from those things. I almost think about it as like an oyster, right? An oyster has an irritant, and it wants to wrap it in a pearl so that it doesn't feel that irritant. We can have things that we're very insecure about, that we're worried about, that we don't want to be perceived in certain ways, etc. And in some ways, our mind can work pretty hard to not allow us to get on the track of finding out what it is that's really bothering us.
By acknowledging your emotion, you're able to give yourself an opportunity to respond to emotion.
Right. So once we recognize what's pushing the button on our emotions, if we can do that, then that helps us decide how to respond to it. Right. So oftentimes, our emotions will serve to focus our attention. So anger is a really dangerous emotion because it's an aggressive emotion. And so when I'm feeling angry, the impulse that I have is not to try to understand what that other person is thinking. Like, I wonder where they're coming from, right? My anger is telling me to destroy, right? To go hurt somebody else so that I can inflict my will from an evolutionary sense. And so in the midst of an emotion, it's not always the easiest time to reflect and understand.
So that concludes our conversation on understanding emotions. On our next episode, we'll talk about accommodating emotions.